Epic Originals presents Creepy Cafetorium, Book 1, The Gelatinous Twin, written by Joe McGee with Colleen A.F. Venable, illustrated by Anna Maria Young, performed by Andrea Ems. Welcome to Newville Elementary, home of the world's oldest cafetorium. What's a cafetorium? Well, it's a room where the walls and tables and chairs and bleachers and doors and gravity can all move and change on a whim. 1 minute it's a cafeteria, then suddenly it's an auditorium, or a gymnasium, or a wormhole to a whole other dimension, where I'm 17 feet tall and can breathe fire. I mean, only in theory, of course. I'm Gertie, your guide, and I know this place better than anybody. In my 60 years working in a cafetorium, I've seen all sorts of things. You gotta be on your toes in a cafetorium. And if you're really smart, you should be on your toes while you sit on someone else's shoulders. Though I can assure you, the floor only turned into lava once. Today's story is about our very own Liz Dawson, champion eater, well loved by her peers, and about to find out what happens when you eat 1 or 2 or 29 too many servings of Jell-O. Jell-O Day. Best day ever. Liz Dawson held the record for the most Jell-O squares ever eaten in one lunch period. 29. 29 jiggling, wriggling, quivering squares of lime green Jell-O. Liz Dawson was reminiscing about the time Tucker Baxter tried to beat her record and got so sick that it took 4 mop buckets to clean up the mess, when her thought was interrupted by Lunch Express staff number 1, who everyone just called Les 1. No one had ever figured out Les 1's name, because they never stopped talking long enough for a kid to ask. Like always, they were in the middle of one of their stories, seemingly having a full-on conversation with the mashed potatoes. But it winds up the aliens didn't even like mashed potatoes. I know, right? Who doesn't love mashed potatoes? Everyone loves you, they said, looking adoringly at the spuds. Liz Dawson slid past Les 1 and stopped in front of Les 2, the wielder of the Jell-O tongs. Jell-O was an absolute staple of Liz Dawson's diet. She ate it almost every day. "Load it up," Liz Dawson said, pushing her tray forward. She put on a friendly smile to get on the employee's good side. No one knew whether Les 2 even had a good side, or any sides at all, for that matter. since they never did anything but face forward. But if they had a good side, Liz Dawson wanted to be on it. Les, too, stared blankly above everyone's heads, even Alex, the tallest kid in the pool. The tongs moved like one of those arcade claw machines. Move, drop, pick up, move forward. Plop. One big, bright green square of gelatinous goodness wiggled in the little recessed rectangle of her lunch tray. It was like they were made for each other. "Thank you," Liz Dawson said. Les, too, didn't respond. In fact, no one had ever heard Les, too, speak. Rumor had it Les, too, was a robot. Now, you're only supposed to go through the line once, but Liz Dawson was an expert at sneaking back in at the end and getting seconds and thirds and 23rds. When she got to the front again, Les One was still talking, slapping a perfectly square serving of potatoes onto Tiana's tray. "I mean, I've always liked the song, but I don't own a boat to row, 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 and my butt never has dreams, so I'm not sure if I can really relate to that song." Liz Dawson positioned herself right back in front of the keeper of the Jell-O. Move, drop, pick up, move forward, plop. Liz Dawson only made it through 3 cycles before Mr. Noodle Strudel, the lunch monitor, made her take her seat at table 18. "Liz Dawson," he said. Everyone always used Liz Dawson's full name. Even the teachers. "That is quite enough Jell-O." Wrong. One can simply never have enough Jell-O. But Liz Dawson supposed that on that day, she'd have to be happy with only 3 squares. Gertie, the ancient custodian, stopped pushing her squeaky mop bucket. Gertie peered at the tray through her giant glasses, then lifted them, squinted at the Jell-O, and put them back down. Gertie didn't blink once. In fact, after years of working in the cafetorium, Gertie had learned to never blink. A lot can happen in a cafetorium blink. "Only 3 squares, Liz Dawson. Better luck next time," she said. Then Gertie resumed slowly wheeling her squeaky mop bucket through the cafetorium. Looking at her speed, you'd expect it to take her 100 years to get to the other side. But somehow, she always seemed to show up very suddenly. Liz Dawson straightened her tray, set her napkin on her lap, lifted her fork and... thunk. She hit plastic. No Jell-O, just the hard orange tray. There should have been 3 squares of jiggling Jell-O waiting to be devoured. There were not. Instead, Liz Dawson looked at an empty plastic indent. "Okay, which one of you took my Jell-O?" she asked, glaring at the kids around her. None of them were listening or looking up or paying any attention to anything. Jeremiah, a lover of vocabulary quizzes, was too busy explaining what the word widdershins means to his friend Remy. Apparently, it's when something goes the wrong direction. Esme was wearing her bike helmet indoors and looking around nervously. Liz Dawson started to ask why, but just then, Declan played the first notes of his daily lunch performance of Row, Row, Row Your Boat on the Cafetorium piano, and it was no use trying to talk while Declan was playing. That was exactly why no one heard Liz Dawson yelp when she spotted her prized Jell-O squares wiggling down the middle of the lunch table. They inched forward like gelatinous, Jeremiah had taught her that word, caterpillars, leaving trails of sugary slime behind them. And it wasn't just her squares. Suddenly, all of the Jell-O squares started flopping off all the trays on table 18. No one seemed to notice as they crept forward. Only Liz Dawson was aware of the fact that all of the Jell-O squares were now coming together to form some kind of big Jell-O shape that looked like... "Liz Dawson," said a grumpy Mr. Noodle Strudel, looking at the Jell-O version of her. "No standing on the table. That's one strike." "But Mr. Noodle Strudel," the real Liz Dawson said from her seat, That's a strike for you as well," he said, looking at Liz Dawson as if he had never seen her before. "You may be new here at Newville Elementary, but even very new Newvilles should know, No, student or not, that rules are rules. Arguing with the cafetorium monitor is an instant strike." "New student? But..." The Jell-O twin climbed off the table and sat down in an empty seat across from the real Liz Dawson. "Less talking, more eating," said Mr. Noodle Strudel. Then he headed over to table 16 to holler at a kid for sneezing too loudly. Liz Dawson stared at the Jell-O version of herself. It was a perfect copy, hair clip and all. Then it winked at her. Real Liz Dawson grabbed Robbie by the cheeks. She and Robbie had been in the same class since kindergarten. Robbie, look!" Liz Dawson pointed at her Jell-O twin. "Oh, hey," he said. "New kid, you look just like..." He reached across the table and high-fived the Jell-O creature. "Liz Dawson," he said, which is a compliment because Liz Dawson is awesome with a capital A. She is the Jell-O eating champion of the school and maybe even the world. She once ate 43 squares, or was it 59? She would have eaten more, but they ran out. Jell-O Liz Dawson smiled. Real Liz Dawson did not. She looked like she was about to give her gelatinous twin and Robbie a piece of her mind. But before she could say anything, Dee Dee stopped on her way past table 18. "Liz Dawson," Dee Dee said to the Jell-O imposter, "I don't know what you've done to your hair, but it is amazing. I love the green, just like poison sumac. She's my favorite comic book villain." "It's Jell-O," the real Liz Dawson shouted. "Her hair is Jell-O, and that's not even Liz Dawson. I am I am Liz Dawson. Dee Dee rolled her eyes. Okay, she said. New kid is a little weird. Jello hair? Who'd want that superpower? Ha! Jello Liz Dawson shrugged. Real Liz Dawson growled. Dee Dee handed the Jello imposter an envelope. I'm hosting a cosplay party in the cafetorium next week, she said as she walked away. Cool kids only. She's not even an actual kid, Real Liz Dawson shouted after Dee Dee. She's Jello! Robbie scooted away from the shouting as Mr. Noodle Strudel appeared out of nowhere. Strike two, he said from behind her, yelling in the cafetorium. With a frown, Liz Dawson waited until Mr. Noodle Strudel was gone to glare at the pile of Jello across from her. You're not going to get away with this, she said. Jello Liz Dawson grinned. The bell rang, and everyone lined up to go back to class. Annoyed, Liz Dawson turned and headed to the line to take her place between Tiana Daniels and Jeremiah Foster. But Jello Liz Dawson was already there. How did... Never mind. Get out of my spot, Liz Dawson said, gritting her teeth and putting her hands on her hips to show that she meant business. The Jello copycat shook her head. Her whole head wiggled and jiggled, and the rest of her body followed. It was like a Jello wave that started at the top of her pigtails and ended at the bottom of her green gelatin feet. Sorry, new kid, said Jeremiah. This is Liz Dawson's spot. It's alphabetical, Tiana explained. Dawson, she said. Pointing at Jello Liz Dawson, goes after Daniels and before Foster. Not, what's your name? But I'm me. I'm Liz Dawson. LizdaWson. How can none of you see that she, Liz Dawson shouted and pointed, is made out of a mound of congealed, flavored, sugary desserts? That's strike three, bellowed Mr. Noodle Strudel. Causing a ruckus in the cafetorium. Principal's office, young lady. Jello Liz Dawson winked, and the line filed out of the cafetorium. Mr. Noodle Strudel grumpily led the way to Principal Rodriguez's office. Liz Dawson had never been there because other than finagling some extra food in the cafeteria, she'd never broken the rules. But it was a nice office. Friendly. There were lots of potted plants and posters of faraway places. She smiled slightly at the one of a bat hanging upside down from a tree, with the caption, "Hang in there. Things will surely get better." Principal Rodriguez's chair was turned with its back toward the door. It sounded like she was sorting through papers or something. Mr. Noodle Strudel announced the 3 strikes. 1. Arguing with the cafetorium monitor. 2. Yelling in the cafetorium. 3. Causing a ruckus in the cafetorium. He left Liz Dawson with the principal. Behavior like this is simply not acceptable, Principal Rodriguez said. Newville Elementary students are always on their best behavior. Always. Even in the cafetorium. Especially in the cafetorium. I mean, after all, it's the cafetorium. What are we going to do with you? Suddenly, Liz Dawson saw it, sitting right there in front of her. A lunch tray. An empty lunch tray. Well, empty except for the tiny green remnants of Jell-O. Principal Rodriguez had eaten the Jell-O. What happens if you eat the Jell-O? The principal's chair began to turn very, very slowly. Liz Dawson shrank back in her seat. She held her breath and gripped the hem of her t-shirt. The big leather chair turned completely around, and Liz Dawson let out a loud shriek. "See," said Principal Rodriguez, "this is exactly the kind of behavior that I'm talking about, Ms. "You're not Jell-O," Liz Dawson said. The principal looked confused, then sighed. "I know it's difficult being the new kid," said the perfectly normal, not at all Jell-O principal. "But you need to understand that rules are rules. We have to uphold them. I'm going to have to call your parents, which is awkward because I'm not even sure what your name is. But you bear a striking resemblance to our own Liz Dawson. Now that girl is something else. She once ate 72 Jell-O squares in one lunch period. You'll love her. Mrs. Parker, will you come here, please?" Liz Dawson opened her mouth to explain that she was Liz Dawson, and that the other Liz Dawson was an imposter, and that it was only 29 Jell-O squares, and maybe she shouldn't cut in line so much and should save some Jell-O for the other kids, when Mrs. Parker, Principal Rodriguez's assistant, opened the door behind her. "Mrs. Parker, will you please get... Honey, can you tell me your... name again?" Principal Rodriguez said, looking at Liz Dawson. Mrs. Parker knew Liz Dawson. She and Liz Dawson's mom were on the same competitive knitting team. Liz Dawson spun around toward the door, hoping that maybe she could stop this madness. "Mrs. Parker, will you please tell..." Her heart dropped. Her stomach lurched. The words froze in her throat. Mrs. Parker wasn't Mrs. Parker. She was made entirely out of green Jell-O. A grinning, wriggling, quivering Mrs. Parker-shaped mass of gelatinous green cubes. Jell-O Parker winked at Liz Dawson, and Liz Dawson fainted. After that meeting, Liz Dawson never saw the Jell-O version of herself again, and her life basically returned to normal, though she also never saw the human Mrs. Parker again. She avoided the principal's office, but every once in a while, she would run into Jell-O Mrs. Parker jiggling down the hallway. Jell-O Parker always gave Liz Dawson a very knowing look, a look that told her to watch out. Nobody else seemed to notice that the principal's assistant was a human-shaped stack of gelatin squares, or wonder where the original Mrs. Parker went.